Good morning. This is the History Committee of PAA, and we're here to interview Dr. Arland Thorton, who was the past president of PAA from 2001. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm Karen Hardy. I'm from the senior associate from the Population Council, and this is Dennis Hodgson. Yeah, and we will be. I will be primarily asking the questions, and Dennis will add
Come in occasionally.
Yes. So the first question that we have is maybe you could tell us about where you grew up and then where you went to college.
Okay, starting at the very beginning. I'm a Idaho farm boy. So I grew up in southern Idaho, about 20 miles, 30 miles southwest of Boise, a little town. And my first introduction to population things, I guess, was we had one of these signs as you went into town that said, "Welcome to Kuna, Idaho, population 516.
Wow.
And when the next census came out, that sign was changed and it said 534. I have no idea why I can still remember that. Maybe that was a gene that I had that played out later on as well. So I grew up on this farm. We grew sugar beets, onions, sweet corn, row crops in irrigated land in southern Idaho.
Wow.
I ended up and by the way, there were some, I had a very small worldview, but when I got into being a demographer, I discovered that knowing the ins and outs of farm life, the routines, what matters, what doesn't matter, the long hours, the family structure, family modes of organization, those all showed up as I went around the world 20, 30 years later.
Very interesting.
So when I visit a farm in Taiwan and I see the paddy field flooded, and I see Nepali people trying to farm these mountains, I have a feel for it that I think I got growing up milking cows and hoeing beets and changing water, things like that.
Wow. And college?
College, I ended up going to Brigham Young University, and so I started as a freshman there. I thought I was going to be a math major, and math came fine. But then I discovered this field called sociology, and it pretty well hooked me. So, and there I discovered some things called central place theory about how population is distributed. It sounded very fascinating to me, and I discovered in that Dudley Duncan and Don Bogue and a few other people that were important in that area. And I said, I kind of like to study that some more.
Was it an undergraduate population course?
Yes, yes. Well, that wasn't titled population.
Yeah.
The word demography was, I don't think, was yet in my vocabulary.
Right.
And population studies, probably not either.
Yeah.
But the topic was covered.
The topic was there, yes.
So you graduated with a degree in sociology?
Degree in sociology.
And did you go directly to graduate school, or did you do something in between?
I graduated from my undergraduate degree in the spring of 1968. And I very excitedly and confidently applied to universities. Ended up being accepted and giving fellowships and so forth from University of Michigan. And 1968 happened to be the year that Lyndon Johnson decided that we should be drafting college grads and not sending them off to more school and more college deferment.
That was 1 year before they came up with the lottery.
Was it? 68 was 1 year before?
Yeah, 69 is when they came up with you're going to be subject to the draft for 1 year
Okay.
on the basis of your birthday.
Right.
Right. So you got in there.
So
Just in
I
time.
was, I got in there just in time. So I ended up going to officer candidate school in the Coast Guard. I spent a beautiful fall in Yorktown, Virginia. It was a beautiful fall. The activities were a little rigorous and not quite what I was used to. And then after 4 months of that, they assigned me to go to Long Beach, California, and they assigned me to be the training officer in over Coast Guard reserve units on the West Coast. So I assigned people to training programs and went out and inspected units and made sure their shoes were shined and their clothes were ship-shape. So I did that for 3 years. And I also took the opportunity to spend lots of nights up in the University of Southern California Library researching the Vietnam War.
Oh, interesting.
And I discovered that war, we shouldn't have been there. And but there I was in the military, so I said the best thing for me to do is to be a good, obedient, mouth-shut guy. So went fine. Got out 4 months early. The government made a snafu in that they thought they were starting a big new program and they needed new junior officers to handle it. That didn't come through, so they said maybe we'll let some of you folks out early.
That was nice.
I volunteered and started back at the University of Michigan in the fall of 1971.
So initially, did you spend like a semester after you graduated?
I spent the summer semester in
The
Ann
summer
Arbor.
semester.
Yes.
Before
Okay.
you went into the, okay.
Gotcha. So they were pretty fast catching you in the draft.
Oh, very
Wow,
fast.
they
Oh,
were.
yeah. No, I went and talked to the draft board, and they assured me that my number was coming.
Right. I remember that. 1S to 1A.
Wow. But Michigan held your place. That
They
was
held
not a-
my place. The Michigan wonderful training program, and they.
Now, so when did demography enter your lexicon?
When I applied to sociology department, and I had a National Science Foundation fellowship, so I didn't need financial help. But I got this letter from it was either Dudley Duncan or Ron Friedman saying, "We think you might be a good candidate for being a student at our center," and that's got. So it was the Population
It was the
Studies
Population
Center.
Studies Center, yeah.
So I got those two words together. And I went, and I still didn't know what it meant. Demography is a very vague word, and ever-expanding word. But anyway, I went. They treated me very nice. I took courses, and people started calling me a demographer, and it sounded good, and they had smiles on their faces when they said that. And so I sort of became a demographer.
Now, the center back then was still internationally focused on Taiwan, or was it more broad by that time?
Then it was very much part of the Ford Foundation kind of international population movement. So Ron Friedman was doing Taiwan.
Right.
David Goldberg was studying Turkey and Mexico. John Nodell joined pretty quickly
Thailand,
with
yeah.
Thailand. And,
But you had domestic, I mean, you hadn't had any international experience then, so how did you shift to international work?
so I arrived at Michigan, and you know these maps that the Census Bureau used to put out? I don't know whether they still do, but these nice maps.
Yes,
and
of the-
with,
yeah.
Color-coded.
Yes.
Color-coded with all the counties.
They're beautiful.
I put one above my desk that had the 3,000 and some counties on the U.S. And some of them had grown, some of them had lost population, and I was going to explain that. That was what I went to do. That was my project. And I saw all of this international stuff going around about me, but there was also Dudley Duncan wasn't particularly international, and Ren Farley was doing that same kind of population distribution, urbanization thing. Dudley Duncan had long moved on from that sort of thing. I was a naive undergraduate and didn't know that, so that's what I went there to do. And so I didn't get much international things. I took Ron Friedman's course and got that. But I wrote my, so what happened with my dissertation is, so I was going to explain that map. And it got time to write a prospectus. And I couldn't think of anything to do with that map. A lot of people have done lots with that map, but it wasn't clear what I was going to do with it. And so I think my very first PAA, I went and Paul Glick gave a very nice paper on changing family demography, something like that. There weren't very many sessions on that, but that captured my attention. And when I figured out that I wasn't going to do this population distribution thing, got my head going, and I said, okay, how about the relationship between marital stability and childbearing? So people get a divorce or a spouse dies, so you've got fertility interrupted. What does that do to divorce? And also, what's the influence of marital satisfaction and so forth on childbearing?
And this came from a PAA session with Paul Glick.
Yes.
So there wasn't anybody at Michigan who was really into this family
studies.
There was not. No,
Okay.
then they looked at me a little strange,
Right.
like, what are we doing? But they were very supportive,
Right.
and they helped me get through this new topic.
Because that's really become central to your work.
Yeah. That was life-changing.
That's it.
Yeah.
That was the big thing.
But still related back to your growing up years, 'cause
Yes.
the family structure.
Yes. Yeah. It's a little bit like, it turns out that there were quite a few of us young folks getting into family demography at exactly the same time.
We're going to be interviewing one tomorrow, too. Andy Cherlin.
Yes, we're basically the same cohort.
We'll just cancel his interview, it's fine.
And Andy and I, we showed up at the same meetings, the same family conferences. It was wonderful.
Right.
But there was Linda Waite, and
Right.
Fran Coburn Goldscheider, and Frank Furstenberg. It was an exciting cohort. I thought I was sort of doing that. I didn't know other people were jumping in. It's a little bit like naming children. A lot of people say, I'm coming up with a unique name. And 5 years later, when that uniquely named child shows up in kindergarten, they got quite a few people with the same name.
Yeah.
That's funny.
And that's sort of the way it turned out here. Family demography, I was delighted, quickly became an important area in demography. And
I think Andy had Valerie Oppenheimer in grad school.
Yes.
And she was, I guess she was one of the big names in family demography at that time.
Yes.
A lot of women work and fertility and those types of issues.
Yep.
So he had somebody at grad school, and you did it all on your own on the basis of interest.
Yeah, so Al Hermelin agreed to chair my committee. Ren Farley was on it, David Goldberg, and Jim Morgan.
Right.
Was the outside committee member.
And your bio says you're a social demographer. Can you talk about what a social demographer is
social demographer?
compared to a demographer?
Well, so I'm a sociologist.
And a demographer.
And a demographer, so that puts them together.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm constantly in trying to explain things and come up with sociological theories that explain things.
So would you say you use more sociology in your work or demography, or it's hard to split them apart?
I don't really split them
Yeah.
apart in my head. And my career has had a lot of relationship with other disciplines as well. So I worked with Deborah Friedman as an economist and Tom Fricke, an anthropologist.
Were there any other grad students at Michigan at the time who sort of influenced your career or what you studied?
Well, Linda Waite was there at the same time, and I'm not sure we influenced each other. I'd like to see the title of her dissertation. I'm not sure it was a family demography dissertation or more of a fertility dissertation. But she very quickly became family demography, and an outstanding one.
And what do you consider your current interests in demography, social demography, or the current focus of your work?
The current focus. So I'll give you, let me tell you the pathway to where I got.
Yeah, yeah.
So a pretty interesting thing happened when I got through with this dissertation. I'd done this, all my work at the Population Studies Center and the Sociology Department, and I knew there was this thing called the Institute for Social Research on campus. Sociology did not have a strong presence there. Howard Schuman and Leslie Kish were there,
Right.
but not a strong presence. Sort of midway through doing my dissertation, a fellow graduate student who was working some over at ISR in the Economic Behavior Program said they're looking for somebody to help them with a project. Are you interested? And I said, well, not really, and it's too early. And a couple months later, he came back and said they're still looking. And I decided, so they had this job, they'd gotten a grant from NIH to study Dick Easterlin's hypothesis about relative income and fertility.
Right.
Right.
And this was a group of economists, and they wanted somebody who had done something with fertility to work with them. I decided, well, they got a 2-year grant there. The proposal looks interesting. Why not? So I said yes, and I saw it as a 2-year postdoc. And in the beginning of that, Ron Friedman, who I hadn't interacted very much as a graduate student, in fact, very little other than his course. And Ron Friedman and Lola Jean Coombs and David Goldberg had done this interview with a group of women in Detroit who had just had a baby.
Detroit Studies Project.
Detroit Studies Project.
Yeah.
And their last interview with those people was 1966. And in the early 60s was when the Ford Foundation and all of the international work had started. And that's when Ron got involved in Taiwan.
Right.
And they'd let this Detroit panel lie fallow. And Deborah was very interested in picking that up. And so Ron and she came to me and said, be nice to have a more junior person here with us. How about you being that person? And my wife and I thought about that and said, oh, this is too good to pass up.
Now, was there a big policy concern at the time? If I remember, it was like 76, 77 when the total fertility rate had plummeted over a child. It was down to 1.8.
Right,
And from way up, 3
Yeah,
point.
3.5 or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, yeah.
And was that like a national concern that got you interested in the sort of fertility and what's happening to it in the U.S.?
I confess, I was almost always driven by the scientific,
Gotcha.
substantive questions.
So it wasn't a concern about what's doing this, what's causing this dramatic decline?
Well, interest in that question, but not so much driven by the policy
Right.
thing of whether we should be concerned about it or not,
Gotcha.
or how we should deal with it if we are concerned, that sort of thing. So that turned out to be a wonderful decision. I kept working with that panel study until, well, sort of the capstone book came out of that in 2007 or something. So that's 25 years of dealing with that project. And that was all different aspects of family demography. And our capstone book turned out to be marriage and cohabitation.
Right.
See, I find that interesting because when I look at what you've done in the context of family issues, so you have marital instability, and you've got a lot on divorce, you've got a lot on what normally we would think of as these were hot topics at the time. And then yet you said you really didn't have a kind of a policy concern that drove your research as much more straight research. And how do you sort of reconcile the fact that in terms of your career, you happen to be looking at rather big issues and dramatic family changes? And admittedly, when you read your research, it's very objective and very well done in the context of it doesn't look like policy-driven research. But
it's very policy relevant.
When you look at the progression of it over time, you say you were picking up on really big trends that did have an element of concern behind
Yes,
it.
exactly. So they were big trends, interesting trends, policy-related. I think I primarily was driven by these are huge trends
Changes,
that's changing the world in many
Yeah,
ways.
absolutely, yeah.
And I'm quite sure the policy part of that helped the funding stream. So Jeff Evans, one of the things I think, one of his many contributions was helping to fund family demography.
Yeah.
And so that would have been driven at least in part by the policy issues. So my guess is there wouldn't have been as much money to fund this kind of research without the policy things. It was there on this project I discovered values and beliefs and attitudes.
Right, interesting.
And it was an amazing phenomenon. The first people are when Ron and Ron Friedman and David Goldberg and Lola Jean Coombs designed that first questionnaire. They put some attitudes, values, and beliefs in that questionnaire. And we said, well, we should repeat them. So they started in 1962, and they interviewed for the last time in '66. And Deborah and I came back and interviewed our first interview in 1977.
Wow.
And so got the interviews in, got them entered, ran out a distribution of everything. And I looked there at the gender role attitudes and attitudes about divorce, attitudes about childlessness. And I look back at the 62 data and I say, oh my goodness, this is a different world.
Wow.
This is a different world. And at that moment, my career changed too. I said, this is too interesting not to study. So the first paper we wrote out of that data set was changing attitudes towards sex roles.
Right.
I think we call them gender roles now, but we called them sex roles back then. And then paper on divorce. It just seemed so natural. And that got me into the whole cultural ideational thing, which is where I'm at now.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so, and then I went to Ron Friedman. I'm not quite sure how this happened, but I said, oh, there's international things going on. There's much more than America. Maybe I ought to go check this out. So I went and talked to Ron about how to get involved internationally and where to go and what to do and so forth. And somewhere along that discussion, he said, we're doing this project in Taiwan. We've had good time working together on the American stuff. Would you like to join us in Taiwan? So that's what took me to Taiwan. was
In that
transition.
family planning literature, you had a tradition of CAP studies, knowledge,
Yeah.
attitude, and
Knowledge,
practice.
attitude,
It
practice,
goes
yeah.
back real early.
And the value of children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Admittedly, it was sort of mixed in with a policy orientation. You want to bring about fertility decline in Taiwan. You want to sort of track that stuff. And if you think in terms of developmental idealism, it seems that
So
there's a connection there
Yeah.
that you came back to in the
Yes.
context of focusing on sort of the family planning issues as one example of how this spreads across countries.
You know, in the developmental idealism thing, it's obvious to me, and
Right.
I hope obvious to others, that international family planning program was a important example of developmental idealism being spread around
Right.
the world. But at that time, my vision wasn't broad enough to see this applied to lots of things.
Right.
But Taiwan is where I discovered developmental idealism. We wrote this book, came out in 1994. The title of it is Social Change in the Family in Taiwan, something
Right.
like that. I was writing, it was my job to write the draft of the theory chapter. So I'm writing theory, and the more I write, the more uncomfortable I get. And there's two reasons for the discomfort. First, all the theory was coming from the West, and I thought there ought to be some
Yeah.
Asian-specific theory.
Yeah.
And worse than that, I knew that these theories did not explain what happened in the West.
Oh, interesting.
So as a graduate student, I learned about this amazing work being done in England by Peter Laslett and Alan McFarlane and a whole team there. And they had discovered that what was believed for 200 years about family change in England and other places in
quite
Northwest Europe, yes, was not quite right. By quite a ways. And so I sat there and I said, this is amazing. I can't keep going on this because I got a theory that's from the West and I know it
Right.
didn't apply to the West. So why am I applying it to Taiwan? And that moment I said, how could we have believed something so fundamentally wrong for 200 years?
Wow.
How could that be? And I said, maybe I ought to find out. So that sent me off to the library and read a whole bunch of old books that hadn't been checked out for a long time. And I discovered where it came from. And it came from this developmental model. The developmental model is everybody, all societies go from not developed to developed. In 1800, they went from backwards and worse to civilized and polished and so forth. And they all go on the same trajectory. And since you can assume those things are true, and you know who's on top, that's England or France, depending on the nationality of the writer. And then Edward Tyler in his version of it, said, well, the bottom is the Aborigines in Africa. Malthus said it was the Aborigines in Tierra del Fuego. Thomas Jefferson said it was the Aborigines in the Rocky Mountains. But if you believe this and you figure out how to put countries in between, and you believe they all go through the same stages, then it's very easy to read the history of the world with cross-sectional data.
Yeah.
So I discovered that. I discovered that around 1990, 91, something like that. And I started writing a book, and I wrote the first half of it, and I was just doing it on my spare time. And finally I said, we'll put that book aside. And when I was elected president in 1999 or 2000, whenever the election occurred, I realized I had a talk to give, and I said, maybe I should give this talk. And in the middle of that, I said, I have to apply this to population directly. So that's when I went back and reread the family planning, international family planning literature. And by then, the gender role revolution around the world, so that popped into my head, and the age of marriage thing. And that's where the Reading History Sideways book came from.
Which is the one presidential talk that I remember the title of.
Great.
Success.
Now, was demography perhaps somewhat responsible in the sense of we had demographic transition theory,
Yes.
and we had the stages,
Yes.
and we had a tradition going back to the 30s of placing societies
On the continuum.
on that continuum and
Yes.
everyone is going to experience those changes. And if you think about family planning, that you have, well, some might need help
Exactly.
to move them along this progression. And when I think about that, I think of, Kingsley Davis,
Yep.
1948 Human Society,
Yep.
and a real structural, functional way of analyzing change.
Yep.
And it seems to give us, still today, some insight as to worldwide regularities and patterns of change. So I don't think we've totally given up on it, but it does introduce a set of kind of knotty issues
It does.
about what's really going on here and why this belief in inevitability of particular changes. Have you arrived at any conclusions on this? Is a biggie because you started out early on in '91, and I just read your really big article in that new journal, Sociology and Development.
Oh.
Yeah, that sort of brings me up to date in
Yes.
terms of what's going on there.
Yeah, that's as up to
Right.
date as I am.
And I was just curious because I remember your PAA address. There was at least in the demography version of it, there was one paragraph where you said, I wanted to say explicitly that this was an illegitimate way of analyzing change, but then you had but I didn't do it. I became more modest.
Yes, that's right.
So that stuck with me. Okay. Anything cause you to sort of reassess perceptions about what this might all be about?
You're very perceptive and got a good memory on that article. Yeah, so on the one hand, thinking everybody goes through the same stages of development, and that where you start really doesn't matter.
Right.
On the one hand, that's totally problematic. But one of my colleagues said to me, well, it's problematic, he said, but what if you don't have anything else? And I said, well, maybe if you don't have anything else and you've got that and you're very upfront on what you're doing, maybe that's better than nothing. Not sure I really believe that. Anyway, that's where that little shift came, is he convinced me it's an assumption.
Right.
And this person's a very sophisticated methodologist. If I remember right, that was Ushia, who is a very sophisticated methodologist, a person I've loved working with. He said, I deal with assumptions all the time when I get into statistical modeling. A lot of us statistical model without paying a lot of attention to the assumptions.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so he said, I deal with them all the time. Just make that assumption very clear, and make clear that lots of times that assumption sent us down the wrong pathway. Yeah, very perceptive.
Now,
So what I'm, go ahead.
no, I was
please.
going to ask you if you could tell us, like, the few people that you might identify as being ones that you've closely worked with over time. You have so many jointly authored things, so
yeah.
I'm just thinking of the ones that sort of you felt a real resonance, that you're working on the same wavelength, and you enjoyed the.
I have been
interaction.
delighted at the collaborations I've been able to have. They've been spectacular in my experience. So I will always feel grateful that Ron and Deborah Friedman came and invited me to work with them on that. We don't have very good ideas on what the paths we didn't take, where they would have led.
Right.
I have no idea. I have no idea on this one. It would have been different. So they introduced me to this study. So I'm doing panel studies now, which I hadn't done before. I was discovering event history analysis. All came out of that. They were spectacular.
They were big.
Yeah. And Ron, giant in the field, he turned it over to Deborah and I, and if we came and asked him for advice, he was happy to give it, but he turned it over to us.
Wow.
And right, so all of these women had just had a baby, and so I said, oh, it'd be nice to interview the babies, who were then 17.
Wow.
So that turned out to be you don't need very many good ideas in this field. That was a good one that I had. So one good idea was joining up with them. And another good idea was thinking about the intergenerational part of this.
Right.
And that turned out to be very good.
That's where we see so much change, is particularly in family trends.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
It's
between the
across generations.
generations.
Yep. And Dwayne Alwyn ended up teaching me how to do Lisrel, and we wrote a paper analyzing changing sex roles and put it in a Lisrel format. That was great. The Taiwan colleagues, Ron Friedman had done a really nice job of being a true collaborator with the Taiwanese. And I got to inherit that goodwill and good relationships and wonderful people, great colleagues. Tom Fricke introduced me to Nepal.
Right.
And that was very nice. We went for what Tom calls a walk up in the Himalaya.
How many days was that?
I think we were gone a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
I went up with him and then came back on my own with a guide of Nepali people, of course, and then Tom stayed. That was mind-boggling kind of experience too. I had a little trouble assimilating the family structure of that particular group. I joked with Tom about that the other day. But, so that introduced me to anthropology. Deborah had introduced me to economics, and Tom introduced me to anthropology, and these amazing Nepalis. Walking back from that village, so we're walking down a river valley, and these are mostly Buddhist, and the prayer flags are out, and the trees are blooming, snow-capped peaks up there, the sun up there. Never forget that. And these people, being a farmer, I knew they were farming land they shouldn't be farming.
Sides of mountains.
The sides of the mountains, yeah, not the terraces. Yeah.
And they weren't that kind of mountains. They were
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
And stuff.
So that was, so Tom, that was a marvelous thing to do. Bill Axon joined us on that as a graduate student and then kept going with the Nepal things, and that was very good. See, who else? I'll forget something and leave out somebody important.
Remember, you can always go back.
That's what you can edit. That's what the editing is for.
Don't worry about it.
But the more recently, what's happened is with this developmental idealism thing, at the end of my book on that, I thought I was done with this particular topic.
And then everybody started writing to you saying, we want to work with you on this in X country and Y country.
Yeah, that's yeah. So I said, wow, I can document this in the writings of the United Nations and the Chinese Communist Party and the International Population Movement. It's all pretty clear, and that's what I did in the book. But I said, I don't know what individual people think. Does that
Surveys, yeah.
that guy out there in that farm in Nepal, does he know about the value of development and how you get there? And what about those folks in China and shopkeepers in Argentina? So at the end of that book, I lay out a brief research agenda, and I said we should start this. And I was delighted. Several people came to me and said, yeah, let's start. And my first reaction was, I got some things to finish up. And they said, well, we're ready. And I said, well, if you're ready, I better be ready. So Bill Axon, we did, first thing we did on that was in Nepal. And then Catherine Yount, who was at Emory, she came to me and said, this developmental idealism stuff is huge in the Middle East. It's part of the tension, part of the conflict is this very issue. So she said, let's do something in Egypt. And so we did something in Egypt. And former graduate student says Argentina would be interesting. So we did some focus groups in Argentina. And so then started giving talks based on that, and at the end of the talks I'd say, if you have interest in joining up on this, let me know, and people started stepping forward.
So you have a small army now.
Yeah.
People.
It's turned out to be absolutely delightful. We've done something in 19 or 20 countries.
Wow.
It's been exciting. I've enjoyed it a lot. And so I get to meet new people. I'm not going to go to Iran on my own and study developmental idealism, or Turkey, or Nepal. But people step forward, and I say, yeah, let's do it. Let's try it.
Now, we probably should save some time.
I know.
for the
Okay, so,
PAA
but I do have to
demography.
ask this question
Sure.
because you have, so many important, things that you've worked on. What would you say is your favorite or most influential publication?
You
Or
can
maybe
name,
that's
you
not
can
even-
name two if you
Or
want.
three? We've already heard three. The family. You don't have to answer that question.
Well, at the time, each one of them was
Right,
the most
big.
important.
It's like asking which is your favorite child. It's okay.
Right.
Yeah, maybe. Well, let's switch to PAA. You've talked about the first meeting that you went to and the influential paper. What have you seen as the changes in PAA over the years that you've been attending?
It's been a long
The meeting.
time.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has. That's a little scary, too.
Right?
You know, when I went in 1971, I think we think we were in Toronto that year.
Right. I remember that.
It'd be nice to see that program. I think that program would have been dominated by international
Oh,
family
definitely.
planning.
Oh, interesting.
And we wouldn't have
Yeah.
had 23 simultaneous sessions going on.
That's true. That's true. So it was smaller
Right.
and more focused. There wasn't very much, I don't think there was very much on mortality.
Right.
I don't think there'd been very much on migration. I'm sure there would have been things there.
Right.
Um,
But the focus on family and family planning.
I think the focus was on family planning. And I think other than this session by Paul Glick, that he didn't do the session, he had a paper in the session, but that was, I think that would have been maybe the only one in 1971.
Right.
And now we're much bigger, and the list of topics is much bigger. So I think I had a little bit of a hard time in 1975, 6, 7, 8, saying that divorce was part of demography. I think some people would have defined it as out. But with Andy and Linda and, I didn't mention Larry Bumpus and Jim Sweet.
Frank
You know,
Furstenberg.
Yeah. It all soon became part of PAA.
Right.
And
And that's a good thing.
yeah, from my point of view,
Yeah,
it's, really good. And studying school and mobility and occupational attainment, I don't think there was very much here then.
Back
Although
then-
Dudley Duncan was doing it, so if he was doing it, it
was
almost had to
okay.
be part of PAA. But that's, I think, the expansion of topics at PAA has been pretty amazing, and I'm delighted. I like demography being a big tent.
So you're not worried about I would say back then, most of the people attending a PAA meeting would have a definition of themselves as being a demographer. And I don't think that's true today. So you've got a lot of diversity, but you do probably have a lot more people, percentage-wise anyway, that have a discipline connection. I'm an economist, and I happen to be studying these things, so
Yeah.
I'm a sociologist. And is that something that is beneficial or something that's potentially problematic?
I think it's beneficial.
Okay.
I'm not coming up with downsides.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see downsides there. One thing that happens is people say this is where good work gets done.
Yeah.
And good work that's related to our topics is, we should be hearing about it. So we recruit some people in exactly on that.
Right.
Interesting topics at PAA, and it's pretty uniformly good. And some other meetings we go to, we say, well, they're a little more mixed, and so.
I've also heard people say, and the people who go to PA are so nice.
Yeah, it's a great
A
group.
great group.
And after you've been here a while, you just go out and stand in the main hallway
know,
and meet your
yes,
friends,
I
and
That's right.
you don't get this anonymity.
Right, exactly, yeah. And what issues did you deal with as PAA president?
Yeah, what were the big concerns back then?
Yeah,
That's
in
2001.
2001, so-
2001.
Do you remember anything that was something that you had to cope with?
I don't remember any emergencies
Okay.
or anything like
No
that.
financial problems that seem to be.
The organization, in my opinion, is run amazingly well. Stephanie Dudley was wonderful to work
Right,
with.
right, yeah.
The program was a bigger thing to put together. I mean, that's the president-elect's job, and it's a good job for the president-elect. That was big,
Yeah.
but no, we had people are very willing, helpful in terms of passing on knowledge. Stephanie was wonderful. I don't remember any big issues.
And what do you think are the big issues facing PAA today?
So one of them has to be keeping the journal going well. I think demography is one of our major contributions. So when you get this conflict between printed material and the web, so how do you make sure you keep that vital? I think keeping up with cost is a problem. So my first PAA didn't cost me $250 for a hotel room.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm making more now than I was then. $250 on a hotel room seems pretty.
But what a hotel room.
You're right. You're right. Exactly.
Wow. Well, what do you see as the important issues facing the discipline of demography today?
So I think the funding climate, of course, is important.
Particularly today.
Yeah, particularly today. And we've had other days that have been particularly tough, too. So being able to train demographers with training grants and that sort of thing, I think is crucial. And people going through population programs get stamped with the label demographer, and they don't lose that. So it's an important part. So if people are worried about too many people coming in from other disciplines, the training programs at the demography centers, I think, is a counterbalance against that.
That's true. I'm just thinking that I went to Cornell's Population Center, and we had a distinctive methodology as a discipline. We had, life tables. We had a set of sort of demographic techniques that were ours, and we had a set of data sources that were ours.
Yep.
And this is, we could do this. We could make a life table from the mortality data. Now, when I look today, I don't think we have that anymore. Most of what we do tends to be with a shared methodology that crosses sociology and economics, and we have a heavy reliance on survey data. We don't really have that much of a reliance on a distinctive set of data sources, and we don't really have a reliance on a distinctive set of methodologies. If people take those courses, they generally don't use them when they do their research. Is that a potential issue or not in terms of the discipline, to lose their distinctiveness in terms of
Methods.
data sources and methodology?
Well, in the life table, which, that was...
Yeah, I remember that.
So there's two key components of demography, if I got it right. One is that today's population is the same as yesterday's, plus births, minus deaths, plus or minus net migration. So that's a fundamental thing.
Right.
And those processes aren't particularly
Complicated.
related substantively. So the theory of fertility is a little different than the theory of mortality.
Yeah.
But that's what held us together, I think, in the very beginning, was that little equation. And then I think the life table was the second thing. I think we've been successful in exporting that life table. So now everybody's doing life tables, and all this hazard modeling and all that is just a multivariate.
I think we'll finish up. So, okay.
is a multivariate
We're not gonna
life
run over.
table.
He's got 5
Version,
minutes to
yeah,
go.
yeah.
Okay, okay.
And so
No, that's okay.
everybody is
Okay for time?
everybody who's studying anything that's a transition across time is using some kind of a life table
Right.
outgrowth. So my colleagues who are studying the dissemination of United Nations human rights treaties
Right.
around the world. So the treaty gets signed in New York and people have to ratify it. And so some ratify the next day, some never do.
You got a life table.
We got a life table.
Yeah.
And these people don't have the foggiest idea that demography is a thing.
Right.
It's just how you analyze this.
Now, is there something we forgot to ask you that you would like to be included in this?
Good question.
Because we have about 2 minutes left, right? Oh, we've got
About
4
4
minutes
minutes.
left.
Okay,
So
yeah.
we picked the questions, and that's not fair because you might have points you'd want to make.
You've done a very good job of asking me things that I think are highly relevant.
Yeah.
Any words of wisdom for new entrants to the field today?
Yes, yes.
So we have a lot of young
Aspiring
people
demographers, yeah.
who I see it just looking overwhelmingly female as opposed to what it used to be.
Yeah, the gender distribution
Right.
has changed. What fraction female are we today?
I don't,
Not
70?
sure, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
70.
Yeah. So any words of wisdom for new entrants to this discipline who will be doing this in, 2030, 2040, 2050, whatever this might be?
I guess I give graduate students and postdocs this might be worth saying is pick things that you're passionate about. Do things that captivate you, that are enjoyable, that are fun. And if you do that, you're going to work all the time, but it won't seem like work.
That's right,
And you pretty much followed that advice for yourself.
Yeah, even without knowing I was following something. I have followed what's interesting to me, yeah, for sure.
And what you're passionate about.
And what I'm passionate about, yeah. It's been, this has been a great field for me because I have been able to do that.
yeah.
So when it came time to implement this agenda on the Reading History Sideways book, I was able to go out and do that.
Yeah.
And it was enormous fun creating that from scratch, pretty much.
Well, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us.
Yeah. Oh, no, I have one last question.
great.
What does the population sign say now in your town from Indiana?
You left it at 534.
534.
Is it still there?
Is it- yeah.
Does the town still exist? That's the question.
Well, there's a lot of people living in the boundaries of that town now. It's become a sort of a bedroom community of the city of Boise.
Oh,
so it has changed.
Interesting.
I get back there, and my brother still farms and
wow.
farms there. He's a very good farmer, very good person.
He's still doing sugar beets and
Yes, yes.
onions?
Not onions, sugar beets. They've added mint. But I think when I ask somebody, we're probably 15 or 20,000. So I don't think it's on the sign anymore.
They ran out of room. Got big enough, they ran out of space. Oh, thank you so much. Thank
You're
you.
very
This was
welcome.
really-
It's
this
been
was
delightful.
interesting.
You've
was
asked
fun.
good questions, enjoyed the interaction. Thank you.